Okay, where I left off last time, I was talking about the change from the modern world to the postmodern world. Now I'd like to get into the change from the postmodern world to the metamodern world. So, first of all, how do we know we've entered the metamodern world? That's a great question. So, of course, there's no dates, there's no demarcation points. What we have to do is consult people from um, diverse disciplines, diverse methodologies to realize that there's something fundamentally changing uh, with human consciousness. So we will look at somebody like Luke Turner, who's an artist. He wrote the Metamodernist Manifesto. Of course, he's going to talk about, he refers to this period as the Metamodern period. Timotheus Vermeulen, Robin van Denneker, they're both cultural researchers, Europeans, essentially philosophers, and they too call this cultural era the metamodern that we're currently living in. Jeffrey Nealon, he refers to this period as the postmodernism, and he's interested in how this affects capitalism. Alan Kirby refers to this period as digimodernism, and he has researched how technology has affected culture. So these are all interesting perspectives. I just happen to refer to it as the metamodern period because it aligns more with my ideas going forward. But so I refer to this period as the metamodern period, but a lot of these terms can be used interchangeably. So let's get back to the postmodern period first here. Really, what it was about questioning everything we didn't question for 300 or 400 years previously. We can look at the roots to these ideas, perhaps going back to the late 19th century. I like to think of it maybe in the 1920s. There was an idea called the hermeneutic circle that began, and what it actually said is that any phenomena, any reading that we do, anything we experienced, is based on the observation of the subjective observation, which is an important distinction, of that reader or of that person who experiences it. So, in other words, if we read a text, it means something different to every single person that reads it because every one of these people have had different experiences in their lifetime based on their culture, based on their history, based on where they lived, based on the time they lived. It makes things a lot bigger. It makes things a lot more complicated, right? So, does it make it true? Perhaps, but it also makes it less objective. So that's really what we turn to, is we turn to a subjective world, and this is just the beginning. This idea. So a couple decades later, 1947, out of the Frankfurt School of Philosophy, Horkheimer and Adorno write the Dialectic of Enlightenment. So it's a work of critical theory, essentially saying the Enlightenment itself was a failure of freedom, which is an astounding idea, to say the least. So to say that everything we believe to be true, all the great ideas, all the great rational ideas of enlightenment, was not a truth, and in fact, it got us further away from freedom. Um, pretty, a pretty 180-degree turn from anything that we've had considered for a long, long time. So from here, we build into new ideas of fracturing of identity. What is identity? Who are we? We sort of run out of space. It's been called the I think it was Frederick Jameson that said that it's the end of everything. It's the end of the era. It's the end of everything. Where in the modern world, Ezra Pound said, "Make it new. Let's progress. What's the next thing? Let's keep going here." The postmodern was about stopping progress. So we have these philosophers saying words are not truth. We can't rely on words anymore to give us truth. And there's new power structures based on these new subjective notions of complexity, that these unidentifiable and unscientific ideas of power are really the number one issues in our lives that we have no way of dealing with. So we start to tell stories. We can't measure these things by science, so we're using a new type of philosophy. An incredible new way of looking at life all of a sudden. And this is a deep unconscious in the consciousness of human beings that, you know, philosophers are trying to articulate it, but most people are not understanding it in themselves. So what we end up is a couple generations that grow up with nihilism and with ideology, and they're trying to make some sense out of this new world. We essentially threw away the rational world. So that's the postmodern. Let's again step back and move forward, I should say, to the metamodern world. We'll move back to Luke Turner. Oscillation is the term that he uses. So it's the common theme here is that we need to learn the truths of subjectivity, because they feel real, right? All our understandings as we experience them are truths to the individual. So there is something to learn from the postmodern period. However, we can never lose the objective truth, one, in the modern world. So Luke Turner says it's an oscillation of sincerity of the modern world, of that intent, that distinction that we had fought for, you know, sometimes scientifically, in the modern world, and the cynicism and the double meaning of the postmodern world. So essentially the cynicism that we used as a shield, or as sort of an armor in the postmodern world, becomes a form of sincerity in the metamodern world. It's really sort of sometimes you can refer to it as like a quantum understanding of our consciousness. So it says that humans have evolved to the point where we can start to use these techniques to communicate, and it's definitely an artist perspective of reality. So we're once again optimistic. However, we can use some of the ideas of the postmodern world that brought us cynicism in the first place. So kind of complex, but definitely interesting to think about. Seth Abramson, he's a Huffington Post writer, writes a lot about the metamodern world. He says that we have layers of reality, right? So there is a subjective and objective reality, but we've developed to the point where we can understand both. So a lot of the same themes there, rather than so the big idea here is that we need to introduce generations to this puzzle here, and that's where I go with it, because really, if we're going to step back and look at the big picture here, human cultural eras, as we move on through history, are diminishing in length. However, the generational time periods, as they're changing, they're staying static, right? So there's not really going to be much change to the generational periods. Humans are reproducing at pretty consistent basis, which happens to be 20 years or so. So, you know, we're getting to the point where we're not having children until a little bit later in life, but that doesn't change for the most part, or has not changed, I should say, the differentiation and the new characteristics of human beings. So what we're doing is we're becoming completely different people faster. The static time frame of generational change is competing with this exponential changing of cultural eras. So it's an interesting idea to consider, and I'm not sure that anybody has studied it or considered it extensively, and that's really where my research has led, and that's why I wrote the book. So these changes are causing generational collisions that are more acute and they're more distinct. So we've got, you know, my big focus is on, of course, the baby boomer generation, because they are our leaders in our current environment. And Generation X is a smaller generation born in the postmodern, living in the metamodern world. And then the millennials, of course, were born in the late postmodern era and have come of age completely in the metamodern era. So what I find interesting is that the baby boomers were born in the modern world. They came of age in the metamodern, yet they lead in the metamodern world. The Generation X, they were born in the postmodern world and live in the metamodern world and beyond. The millennial generation, which is the most interesting, have come of age in the metamodern world, and they're the only ones who can completely access this new cultural period. And that's my starting point, is saying, okay, if we've truly entered a new cultural period, who best to sort of collect and disseminate the information of the new cultural era than the only generation of adults who've completely accessed it from their entire adulthood. They didn't have the baggage that came along with these this long period of postmodernism that broke from all our traditions in history. So it's very interesting to begin at that point, and I'm going to move forward from there in my next video. Thanks.